warm welcome to you all. My name is Jason Liem. I run a company called MindTalk, and for the last 20 years I've been working with corporations and organizations at an individual level and with groups through workshops and through talks and such, where I teach resilience programs. What I mean by that is that my background's within clinical and counseling psychology, pretty much the cognitive sciences. And my job, in a sense, is to help people to be more reflective in their day-to-day when they're faced with pressures and stresses and anxiety. And what I'd like to do is to teach people skills and knowledge so they become more resilient. Because it is inevitable. All of us face change. All of us will be hit by inevitable setbacks. But the question is, how fast can we bounce back from those setbacks? And that's what I'd like to kind of dive in with you today. Right after this slight introduction, we're going to jump in and we're going to take an unorthodox approach to learning how to deal with change. And so without further ado, we're going to start the webinar. Well, welcome to this webinar, where we're going to be talking about how to handle change with the brain and mind. We're going to be taking an unorthodox approach about how to move into change and how to be agile, how to adapt to a growth mindset. And actually, what does that mean, sort of skill-wise? Now, one of the things I want to first talk about is our relationship to certainty and uncertainty. Now, anytime we move into a new situation, our brain is looking at two elements. First is looking at the resources. Now, those resources can be external resources that belong to us, our money, our time, and our efforts. It can also be our internal resources, talking about our level of self-confidence, but also our level of self-doubt. Like, what is the narrative that is running through our heads, the mind talk? Is that narrative, those thoughts that we're listening to, are they thoughts that build us up? Or are they thoughts that sort of tear us down? Now, the second element the brain is looking at is the demands of the situation. What are the demands of that situation that draw from our resources? Now, in familiar situations where there is a lot of certainty, this may be at work, this might be in your private life, but in those familiar situations, this is what the brain loves, because our resources, both internal and external, far outstrip the demands of the situation. We're very comfortable in these situations, and thus we feel at home because we have a certain level of clarity, a certain level of control, and definitely a certain level of certainty. Now, change comes in sort of two flavors. The first flavor is that change that we invite into our lives. We may take on new responsibilities, a new position or job. Maybe we move from sort of a traditional technical job into a more managerial role. Perhaps on our vacation, we decide to go to a new country or to a new city that we've never been to before. And there's that sense of exploration and experience that we wish to look into. Now, in those cases, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's still a lot of question marks, but we're motivated because we've invited it into our lives. The other flavor of change is when that change comes uninvited into our lives. It's something that we have not asked for. We didn't expect it, and we don't really want it per se. Now, two people can be faced with the exact same change. Again, this is change that has come uninvited into their lives. We can take, for example, two people, Jason being me, and we can take another person, Jane. Now, Jane sees the change in a different way than Jason. Her narrative is much more constructive. It's much more positive. She tends to focus on the solutions. Now, again, she doesn't like the change. She doesn't even want to deal with it. But in her head, she's thinking, I have to deal with it. She may not know what the end game is, but she's thinking about the first step. Who do I have to talk to? What are the knowns? What are the facts? How am I going to move through this? And so her self-talk, her narrative tends to be one that builds her up. And thus, her brain's interpreting it. Okay, Jane, so you have just a little more resources than the demands. And so her brain sees that situation as a challenge. Now, Jason, on the other hand, is faced with the exact same changes we've just previously spoke about. But his narrative going through his head. His mind talk is about, I can't do this. Why does it have to come now? I can't believe this. I've got so much else. I'm never going to get this. Now, you can see the difference in their mind talk. You can hear the difference in their self-talk. Jane is building herself up, but Jason is tearing himself down. He's focused on things that he can't control. He's focusing on things that he has no influence over. And thus his brain reacts in a way to meet that self-talk or that mind talk. Thus his brain interprets, okay, Jason, I see what you're saying. So you don't have enough resources, and the demands far outstrip those resources. So his brain goes into a threat mode. Now, there is a difference, because this is not just a psychological phenomenon. This actually has physiological implications. Where Jane is building herself up, she doesn't have to be positive. Maybe the situation is bad, and any way she cuts that situation is bad, but she moves into it with a constructive mindset. And because she's motivated to deal with it, that psychological mindset has a direct influence on her physiology. Her blood vessels start to dilate, blood flow starts to increase, and she becomes more physically and mentally capable. Jason, on the other hand, well, his blood vessels contract, blood flow decreases, like physically and mentally, he feels less capable. So it's the same change, but one person sees it as a challenge, another one sees it as a threat. So now what I'd like to do is take a little deeper look at our relationship to uncertainty and certainty. Now, if we step back 10, 50, 100,000 years ago and actually look at the evolutionary reasons for certainty, the brain loves the familiar. Because if we think about our ancestors there on the African savannah or some part of the jungle, he or she knew where their food sources was. That was certainty. Where the water source was. That was certainty. Where the dangerous animals were. That was certainty. In that case, the brain is telling the man or the woman, stay where you are. Certainty is safety. Certainty means you're saving life and limb. Uncertainty means a potential death or loss of life and limb. Now, but if we look at it at a modern perspective, if we think about certainty and uncertainty and stretch it along a timeline where certainty is about the past, the past is sort of what we've achieved, what we've succeeded. They are lessons learned. They are things that we've experienced. Uncertainty is more about the future. It's sort of the unpainted canvas. It's unscripted. It has not come to fruition yet. So now let's take a deeper look into what actual certainty is. Now, we can think of certainty as having both the good and the bad, sort of the yin and the yang. So if we ask ourselves, what do we want when we feel uncertain? Well, the obvious answer is we want certainty. Because certainty, sort of the good of the certain, means it brings a sense of security, safety, and stability. It allows us to have a sense of clarity, meaning that our brains know what to expect. When we feel a sense of control, well, that adds to our confidence. But certainty also has its kind of darker side. And we can answer that if we ask ourselves the question, how do you feel if there's too much certainty? Think about if you've been on the job for too long, or you've mastered that job, and there's no more sense of challenge or growth or development. Well, I think we've all felt this. When we feel a sense of routine, when we feel bored, then we become complacent. We kind of just settle for what's going on, and we just go through the routines of day in and day out. And that's when we start to think, I gotta change things up a little. And thus we start looking over the parapet, over this fortress we call certainty, into the wild, which is uncertainty. And then this is where we want to look at sort of the good and the bad of uncertainty. How do you feel if there's too much uncertainty? Well, we don't like it. We feel disoriented. When we're too far outside our element of comfort, we become worried and concerned. We can feel the angst and the anxiety sort of seep into us. It makes us indecisive. We're filled with doubts and such. But if we ask ourselves also, why should we sometimes embrace uncertainty? Well, it's an uncertainty where learning and growth and development It is the realm of experimentation and exploration. It's where opportunity lies. And so, if we look at this timeline between certainty and uncertainty, most of my experience working as a sparring partner with people in different organizations is that a majority of us tend to see the future by framing from our back what's behind us. We have an anxiety about moving into the future because we we tend to fall into a certain cognitive bias, a certain fixed way of seeing things where we're thinking about all the things that we're going to lose. We're thinking about all the downsides and the negativity that change will bring. And thus, yes, there will be downsides and there will be some level of negativity, but we need to be able to balance that perspective with all the gains. Of course, we're going to lose something, but what else are we going to gain? Some doors will close, but some doors will open. So, what I want to talk about now is about seeing change from a different perspective. And that change is seeing change from the future. Now, for example, take a look at anything around you, the clothes that you're wearing, the monitor you're looking at. Maybe you're seeing this webinar through your telephone or through a pad. Think about the chair you're sitting on, or in the building or the room, or anything else in that room, that the lamp, the desk, what have you. All of that started as an idea in someone's head, whether it was a scientist, an engineer, an architect, an artist, what have you. Each of those things started as an idea, and each of those individuals wanted to bring it into reality. They wanted to bring it to fruition. And so every day they got up, their actions and their decisions and their behavior, everything was in alignment to take that idea and to make it real. Of course they had self-doubt. Of course they met the obstacles and blocks and roadblocks. But they were motivated to find ways around it. So what I'm suggesting to you is that when we're facing change, we need to take a much more balanced perspective at it. Can we be inspired by a vision, whether it's professional development we're looking at or some aspect of private in our private lives where we want to develop? So when we're moving into change, in this first part, what I want to do is just kind of summarize this introduction. When us as human beings, if there's too much uncertainty, we are disoriented. When there's too much certainty, we know we go on autopilot. The sweet spot is navigating the tension between certainty and uncertainty, because in that tension is where creativity is, where learning grows. It's where we experience, it's where we achieve new ways to develop and have innovative thinking, to be agile, to actually live this growth mindset. So in conclusion of this first part, remember that the brain seeks a balance between exploiting previously learned knowledge and exploring new possibilities. Now, in this next section, I want to talk about the secret to agile thinking. Now, this building that you see in front of you, this is the Parliament building, Oslo, Norway. Now, you'll find similar parliament buildings in almost every democracy around the world. Now, the reason I want to show you this is that each of us has a parliament in our head. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, in this particular building, you will have different parties. You'll have left, right, conservative, liberal, green. Now, each of these parties wants the best for the country, to lead it forward, to be prosperous. Well, how they do it is going to be different because each of those parties will have different policies and different strategies. Well, in the parliaments of your head, we call these parties mindsets. Now, you have different mindsets depending upon how you see the relationship between certainty and uncertainty, how you see your relationship between the resources you have and the demands that situation requires of those resources. But mindsets are not just psychological phenomena, as we've already talked about. Our psychology has a direct influence on our physiology. Now, one book I highly recommend to all of my clients and workshop participants is a book by Daniel Kahneman. The book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. Now, Daniel Kahneman is the godfather of a whole discipline called behavioral economics. It studies how human beings tend to make decisions. Now, originally we thought we were all logical. Well, from behavioral economics, it shows the only thing that's predictable is our irrationality when it sometimes comes to making decisions. Now, two mindsets I want to introduce to you in this webinar is something called the reactive mindset. Now, this is what I'm going to refer to as your autopilot. The reactive mindset is about fast thinking. It's about unconscious attention, meaning that your brain is constantly monitoring everything around you, looking for potential dangers, whether that threat be real or whether it be a perceived threat. It's also about automatic processing. So the reactive mindset is about the autopilot. It is when you're kind of on robot mode and your brain is just executing habit after habit after habit. Now, the second mindset I want to talk about in the parliament in your head is something called the reflective mindset. Now, I'm going to refer to this as jumping into the pilot seat. Now, when I mean jumping into the pilot seat, it means you turn off the autopilot and you're actually present. You're present to your thinking, you're present to your emotions, and you're present to your behaviors and your actions. The reflective mindset is about slow thinking. So when we slow things down and we use our higher thinking, our logic, and our rationale, where we try to learn from our emotions, it's about how we consciously place our attention. It's about deliberate reasoning. When we take apart a problem, we look at its various components, and then we see how can I put those components back together to come up with a solution. So now we've talked about the reactive and reflective mindsets. One thing I want to tell you is that the brain is a finite machine, meaning it can't run both the reactive and reflective mindsets at the same time. It can either run one mindset or it has to run the other. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you an experiment to do. Now, you may be a test subject Timmy, but maybe you're also a test subject Tammy. Now, whether you're a Tammy or a Timmy, what I'd like you to do now is also grab a timepiece. It might be the watch on your wrist, it may be a smart watch, it may be your smartphone, what have you. Now, the experiment is going to happen when I turn the slide. But first, let me give you some simple instructions. Now, the idea here, what you're going to be presented with is a number of blocks or squares. Now, the squares will either be a color of black, gray, or white. Now, the task here is to read out the color of each block as fast as you can. So you're going to move from starting at the top left-hand side of your screen and move to the right. So it'll be gray, black, white. And then you move down to the next row and read gray, white, gray, then white, black, gray, or whatever the combination is. So you're going to move from the top of the left-hand screen to the right and then work your way down each row until you finally reach the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Okay, so we're just about to run the experiment. Now, when I count down to 3, 2, 1, you're going to begin. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, how did you do? Now, the average is anywhere from about 6 to 10 seconds to do this. Now, you probably found it was quite easy and you moved through it quite fast. But the experiment is not finished here. Now, what I'm going to show you is another slide. But this time, instead of being presented with blocks, you're going to be presented with words. Now, the key here is not to read the words. No, I want you to tell me the shade of the word. Now, that will either be black, gray, or white again. Same thing. You're going to start at the top left-hand corner of your screen and move towards the right. And then you're going to work your way down each row until you end up at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Okay? Now, you ready? When I count down to 3 is when we're going to begin. 3, 2, 1, here we go. Okay, how did you do there? Did you find it more difficult than the first one? Now, when I generally in sort of workshop settings, when I have participants in an audience, I'll ask them. Now, what happened is the first one, people found it very easy. Well, that's the reactive mindset. Because the reactive mindset is just, it works quickly. But in the second slide, when you were presented with these words, black, gray, and white, well, it became a lot more difficult. You probably sensed it into your head. You actually probably felt the two mindsets kind of debating there on the parliament in your head. The reactive mindset, okay, come on, you can prove Jason wrong. Let's race through this. But your reflective saying, no, slow this down. If we're going to do this correctly, we need to slow it down. So you could feel this literal tension, right? Now, this is a fun experiment, but now let's shift to something more serious. What happens if you are in a place where change is coming at you, where it becomes uninvited on your front doorstep? You didn't ask for it, but how do you deal with it? This is when we need to move from the autopilot of the reactive mindset into the reflective mindset, where we're in the pilot seat, where we're aware of our thinking and our emotions and our behavior, so we can make much more cognizant decisions. Now let's look at what the reactive mindset and the reflective mindset actually is. The primary ability of the reactive mindset or the autopilot is just that. It's that sort of survival response, that primal need for us to either fight or freeze or run away. Now, flocking is just that. Sometimes when someone knocks on my door at home, I have twin girls they're quite young, and they'll generally run behind my legs when a stranger comes in. This is the flocking tendency. The reason we freeze from an evolutionary perspective is if the lion goes by and it hasn't seen us, our muscles all freeze up. And maybe if we're just lucky, the lion will pass us by. Now, if we stay in a reactive mindset, well, other abilities come online. We tend to become problem-oriented. We tend to exaggerate those problems. We tend, instead of focusing on the team, we collapse in ourselves and focus on the me. It becomes about survival. We become emotionally hijacked. What I mean by that is maybe the anxiety, the worry, or the concern overrides our thinking. Maybe it's the anger or the frustration. Now, when we're in a reactive mindset, we tend to focus on what we can't control. We constrict our options. Our narrative or our mind talk tends to be much more negative, where we create self-limiting beliefs. If we call back to that, the earlier section on the relationship with certainty and uncertainty, and I talked about Jason and Jane, well, Jason was definitely in a reactive mindset, where his mind talk was about self-limiting beliefs, where he couldn't achieve. So the demands of the situation, as his brain interpreted, far outstripped his resources, and thus he was in a threat mode. Now, Jane, on the other hand, if we use the same example, she tended to get in the pilot seat. She turned off her habitual responses to things, and she was sitting in the pilot seat. When we're in a reflective mindset, like Jane, well, our abilities of flexible thinking and critical thinking come online. Our solid judgment, we make clear decisions. She was able to sort of have impulse or emotional control. It doesn't mean that Jane shut out or squeezed out her emotion. No. What it means is that Jane decided to think about her emotions instead of thinking with her emotions. Jason was thinking with his emotions. That's why he was reactive. That's why he was emotionally hijacked. Now, if because of Jane, or what we want to do, all of us, in sort of change situations when we're under stress and press, we want to stay in the reflective mindset. Because the longer we stay in that, then other secondary abilities come online. We become solution-oriented. We become empowered and motivated. Even though we don't like the change, we become motivated to deal with it. We have also a balanced perspective where we're thinking about ourselves, which is just as important, but we're also thinking about the team or the people or the colleagues around us. We move from being subjective and getting lost in the details to moving to being more objective and seeing the bigger picture. We become open to possibilities and viewpoints. Remember, it's not just about the closed doors. We start seeing where are there also doors that are open to us. If we stay in the pilot seat, we become creative and innovative. We tend to be very conscious about collaborating and cooperating. Okay, now it's time to dive a little more in the science. We've been talking about sort of the psychology and physiology of stuff, of what's going on with us, and talking about the parliaments and the mindsets. But now what I'd like to do is take a look under the hood. What is actually going on? Now, if we do a cross section of the head, there's three players I want to introduce to you here. The first is the brain stem. We can call this sort of the alligator brain. This is the part of the brain where we have no conscious access to. It is basically our arousal system. When we feel awake or asleep, when we're stressed or relaxed, when we're hungry or when we're full, when we're satiated. Okay, it is the home of our sort of fight, flight, freeze response. Now, the second part of our brain that I'd like to introduce is something called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is about the size of a golf ball. So if I drew a dotted line through my ears and then through my eyes, where those dotted lines intersect is where the limbic system is. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details about the limbic system, but basically it's sort of the monkey brain. It's where our emotions are processed. Now, the limbic system is made up of a number of structures and has a number of functions, but we're just going to call it the limbic system for now. Now, in English, we have two words, feelings and emotions. Now, in the context of this workshop or this webinar, feelings and emotions are two separate things. Now, feelings are the raw sensory data that streams in from our senses. So it's like what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, and so on. Now, emotions are emotions. So when the feelings come through our senses, they come through sort of the brain stem, through the thalamus, and then they get input into the limbic system. Now the limbic system, or this monkey brain, is very important because this is where our brains take this raw sensory data and put a meaning to it. Well, what do I mean? If I look outside my window right now, it could be a blue sky. It's just a blue sky. I mean, that's just the sensory information. But I'm thinking, wow, blue sky, it's a beautiful day. That's the meaning I give to something. Or I could look out and see it's raining and it's cold and it's gray. Again, that's just sensory data. But the meaning I give it to is like, oh, another depressing, sad, cold day. Now, the meaning that I put to those feelings, to that raw sensory data, is going to trigger motion. I mean, it's going to evoke motion. Now, human beings are motivated by two things. We either move towards things that we find pleasure in, or we move away things we find painful. Now, that's what emotion is. It evokes motions. We either move towards something we like, or we move away from something we dislike. Now, in the game, we call this sort of a cognitive formula. So as you see at the top right-hand part of your screen there, you'll see you have a neutral feeling that comes in. Again, just sensory data. I put a constructive meaning to it, and I get a constructive emotion. The same thing, neutral feeling comes in. I give it a negative meaning. Oh, it's a bad day. I get a negative emotion. Now, the reason I use constructive meaning instead of positive meaning is just that, because sometimes we're faced with situations, and any way we cut that situation, it is a bad situation. So all the positive affirmations, all the positive thoughts in the world will not help us out. But what we need to do is kind of get on that horse. We need to deal with the situation, and that's why I say constructive meaning. Now, these two together form the reactive mindset, that part of the parliament in our heads. It's when the emotion or the monkey brain is conspiring with the alligator brain to make us go all reactive. Now, that is one circuit. But the third player I want to introduce to you now is something called the prefrontal cortex. Now, it's the part of your cortex that it's kind of located just behind your eyes. It takes about 4% of the brain. It's the only part of the brain that's not automated. In a very simplistic sense, it is who you are. It is your identity. It's the values that you stand for. But your prefrontal cortex, it is the home of all your higher thinking, or sometimes what we call your executive functions. Your ability to reason, your ability to understand, to memorize, to remember, to recall. It is your home where you're able to make decisions. Now, up to the early 70s in Canada, where I'm from originally, is that we used to do lobotomies. Now, these lobotomies is when you used to take an instrument, and you used to slip it under the eyelid of the left eye, under the skull, and where you used to do windshield wiper, where you would actually turn the prefrontal cortex pretty much into minced meat. And what you have is pretty much a person who no longer can have any higher reasoning or thinking. They're pretty much just a zombie just sitting there. They will be able to feed themselves, but they will have no ability to think or to reason anymore. Well, in a sense, when we get super stressed, when we are on autopilot, this is what we do to ourselves. We kind of just turn off that part of our prefrontal cortex and let the monkey brain and the alligator brain sort of run the show. But the prefrontal cortex is just that. If we can bring the prefrontal cortex, if we can turn off the autopilot and actually sit in the pilot seat and be aware and cognizant of our thinking and our emotions and our behavior, well, this is when it overrides the emotional part of the brain. It doesn't turn off the emotions, because what we're talking about here is being both logical and emotional. It means when we bring on the prefrontal cortex, when we are in the reflective mindset, it means what we're doing is that we are thinking about our emotions instead of thinking with our emotions. Okay, let's take this one step further. So we said the brainstem is the alligator brain. It's sort of our arousal system. It is the home of our fight-flight. The limbic system is sort of the monkey brain or the cat brain. It is where feelings get turned into emotions. And how does that happen? Well, when we give meaning to a certain feeling, it evokes either a positive or a negative emotion. Now, the third player was the prefrontal cortex, as we talked about, is the home of our executive functions. Now, if we return back to our brain, what I want to introduce to you now is something called the dopamine pathway. Now, the dopamine pathway, if you see where it begins in the center of the brain, the limbic system, and it feeds into what we just talked about, the prefrontal cortex. Now, you can think of the prefrontal cortex as a high-powered machine or a high-powered engine. What happens if I choke off the fuel line? I know it's a silly question, but if I choke off the fuel line, what will happen is that the prefrontal cortex or the motor will sputter and die out. Well, if I cut off the dopamine pathway that feeds the prefrontal cortex, well, that means most likely my executive functions will get significantly dampened down. Now, how do I get that dopamine flowing? Well, again, it comes back to that cognitive formula we talked about. When a neutral feeling comes in and I put either a constructive or a positive meaning to it, I get a constructive or positive emotion. Now, if we bring it back to Jane, remember Jane was faced with that challenge. She didn't like it, or with that change. But she didn't like it. She didn't invite it, but she was willing to step up to the plate and deal with it. And she was thinking, what are the facts? What are the knowns? What have I dealt with before? Who can I talk to? Where can I search for some immediate answer? Where can I get partial answer? Because she was thinking in this way, the dopamine starts to flow. It feeds into her prefrontal cortex, and all of a sudden her brain is thinking about options, she's solutions. She's seeing all the open doors. Now, on the other hand, remember Jason. Jason didn't see it that way, as Jane said. He decided to take the low road, the reactive road. He decided to stay in autopilot. Now, there's something else called the noradrenaline pathway. Now, noradrenaline, again, you can see it starts from the limbic system and then it floods the brain. It goes everywhere part of the brain except the prefrontal cortex. Now, noradrenaline is not a bad neurotransmitter or brain chemical. Far from it. In small amounts, when it sort of kind of just drips, it allows you to focus. It allows you to shift your focus. But when we are telling ourselves we can't handle the situation, when we're telling ourselves that our resources are too low and the demands are too demanding and that we can't rectify that, well, what happens? Noradrenaline floods the brain and it turns off dopamine, or it significantly dampens it down. Remember, as I said, the brain is a finite machine. It can't run both the reflective and the reactive mindset. It's either the reactive or the reflective. If I choose to go reactive, then the reactive mindset will go online and the reflective mindset will significantly damp down. Now, that's what exactly noradrenaline does. It floods the brain. I mean, have you ever sort of got up at 2 or 3 in the morning and your brain seems to be racing about something that's coming up that day, or a presentation, or something you forgot to do, or a mistake you made, or you kind of messed up some way the day before and your brain's kind of racing with it? You know, it's why did it happen? Why this? Why now? Why now? Before you having a chance to answer one question, another one pops up. The reason for this, and you can't seem to get back to bed? Well, the reason for this is because of the noradrenaline. It's just coursing through your brain. So to close off this section here, I want you to think about that at the end of the day, it's the meaning we give to something that determines the mindset we move towards. If we are on autopilot, more than likely, we will see the world in some sort of perceived threat, and our brain will react such. Because the brain is just like any other organ. The heart pumps blood, the lungs pump oxygen, but the brain itself pumps survival. It goes reactive to keep you safe. What we want to be, in order to have a growth mindset, in order to have agile thinking, it means we have to turn off the autopilots and jump into the pilot seat. We need to be reflective. And what does reflective mean again? Well, it means to be present with our thinking, with our emotions, and with our behavior. Well, let's move into our final section. In this final section, I want to open up my toolbox. I call it the cognitive coaching toolbox. Now, I wish I had time sort of in a workshop setting or in a talk setting where I could present a lot more tools. But what I want to do is at least present to you 2 very effective tools. Now, tool 1 is what's called the bottom-up technique. Now let's drop in just to teach you a little more science of why it works. Now there's a part of your nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. It is made up of 2 branches. The first is what's called the sympathetic, or in more layman's terms, it's sort of the fight-flight part of that autonomic nervous system. It's when your pupils dilate, your heart rate increases, you secrete adrenaline, and your blood pressure increases. Now there's a secondary or another branch to this called the parasympathetic part of the nervous system. This is the rest digest part of your nervous system. This is when your sort of pupils relax, your heart rate decreases, your adrenaline flow stops, and your blood pressure sinks. And we need to do this anytime we need to eat or digest food, or when we need to sleep. Now, if you notice your breathing right now, you'll probably find your breathing is quite regular. When you breathe in, maybe for a count of 2, and you're breathing out for a count of 2. That means your autonomic nervous system is in homeostasis. It means it is balanced. But when we get stressed, what happens is the sympathetic, or the fight-flight part of the nervous system, gets jacked up. It goes into overdrive. And when that goes overdrive, there's an imbalance, and the parasympathetic, or the rest digest, significantly decreases in its actions. So anytime we actually breathe in, we excite our sympathetic, and every time we breathe out, we excite our parasympathetic. And so if our breathing is regular, both inhale and exhale, that means we're pretty much in a calm state. So let's move into the tool now. Now, part of this autonomic nervous system is something called the vagus nerve. It's sort of the major communication highway between the brain and the body. Now, we have no conscious access to the vagus nerve or to this part of the brain stem. But what we can do is access it through our breathing. So sometimes we may be in a very stressed state where our brains are just racing, thought after question after question, and we can't seem to slow it down. So sometimes what we need to do is to use the body proper, or use the body to calm down the mind. So the first technique I'd like to teach you is something called 4-7-8. And this means it's all about your breathing, and it has direct access to your autonomic nervous system. Because if you can turn it off, then you turn off the stress response. So how does this work? 4-7-8 refers to your breathing. So first what you want to do is inhale for a count of 4 through your nose. And then for a count of 7, you want to hold your breath. Now, why do we hold our breath for a count of 7? Well, it's red blood cells that carry oxygen to our brain. What study after study shows us that a count of 7 fills up those little trucks of RBCs, the red blood cells, with maximum oxygen, meaning we're getting maximum oxygen to our head. Now, the 8 refers to us exhaling or breathing out. And what we want to do that is for a count of 8 through our mouth. So it's breathe in for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Now remember I said every time we breathe in, that sort of excites the fight-flight side of our nervous system, the sympathetic. When we breathe out, that excites the parasympathetic or the rest digest. Now, 4, 7, 8. We breathe in for 7. We breathe in for 4, inhale for 4, hold for 7, and exhale or breathe out for 8. 8 is double of 4, meaning that you excite your rest digest part of the autonomic nervous system twice as much as the sympathetic or the fight flight. Now, if you do this breathing cycle for 15 to 20 breaths, you'll find that your autonomic nervous system stabilizes, meaning it turns off the fight flight. Now, it's even good to do this if you go out for a brisk walk to kind of try to burn the cortisol and adrenaline, these stress hormones that are coursing through our bloodstream. Otherwise, we have to wait from anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours for it to metabolize out of our system. Now, the second technique I want to teach you is just simply warming your hands. Anytime you feel stressed, anytime your brain thinks it's a perceived or a real danger, it'll go into threat mode. It'll go into fight, flight, lockdown. And part of that is that it draws the blood from our periphery, from our legs, from our feet and our hands. And that's why our hands feel clammy and cold. One way is to kind of clap your hands together and warm them up. Once you warm your hands up, you draw the blood away from the main part, or you draw the blood back into your hands and they warm up. And your brain's thinking, okay, well, the world is like crashing, burning around Jason, but his hands are warm, so everything must be okay. And so this is another direct way to calm down that fight-flight response. Now, a third technique that I use quite a bit is fingers to lips. Now, it kind of seems kind of odd. I get the same reaction in workshops with live audiences. But what do I mean? Well, if you look at your lips, if you look in a mirror, you'll notice that your lips are a different flesh color from the rest of your skin. The reason is these are actually exposed nerve endings. They are exposed nerve endings that are part of the parasympathetic side of your autonomic nervous system. It's part of that rest digest. So anytime we need to drink something or eat something, it has to first pass through our lips. And so by rubbing our lips, we actually stimulate the rest digest part. You'll naturally see this when someone's talking to you and you're thinking about it, you're pondering, you're considering what they're saying. Sometimes we actually automatically gently rub our lips. Or maybe you're explaining something and the listener, he or she is rubbing their lips as they're contemplating what you're saying. What I'm saying is, if you rub your lips gently, you actually activate the parasympathetic. And this is a great way to directly calm yourself down. Now, if you kind of do all this together, where you're rubbing your lips, you're doing the 4, 7, 8, and you're kind of warming your hands all at the same time, all of these work together to bring you into a much more stable state, where you're in a much more calm state, where you move from the reactive to the reflective. Because remember, reflective is about being in autopilot. And if you are present to your breathing, if you're present to touching your lips gently or present to warming your hands, well, you're in the pilot seat and you're taking back control. Now, the second tool I want to teach you is something that I've developed. This is something I call the cognitive lift. It is to help us to move from the subjective to the objective by sort of just focusing on the problem and the small details and getting lost in those details, to actually seeing the big picture, to seeing things into context so we can make much clearer and cognizant decisions to move forward, to deal with the change that is on or is at our doorstep. Now, what we have here is a simple model. And what it's about moving from the limbic system and triggering the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, the home of our thinking. Now, when we're reactive, you see the little helicopter there. It's kind of sitting there on the landing pad. Now, if I ask the pilot, what does he or she see out the window? Well, they'll just tell me directly what they'll see. Well, I see the parking lot, I see the building and the trees. Well, this is where we are when we are on autopilot, when we are reactive. All of this is about our habitual response to go into sort of primal survival lockdown. What we want to do is move from unaware to aware. And so what I ask a lot of my clients as a sparring partner, or when I'm running group coaching, I'll ask people, okay, guys and gals, what are you thinking right now? What is your gut telling you? What are your emotions? What are you feeling right now? What is your reaction to what he just said or what they just did? How are you behaving? Now, by asking ourselves this, we actually trigger our prefrontal cortex, because the prefrontal cortex is triggered by great questions. And about being aware is like, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I doing right now? And so we're starting to get that sort of cognitive lift. We're gaining altitude. The next one is to move from aware to self-aware. But what is self-aware? Well, self-aware is understanding the reasoning behind our thinking. So the next set of questions we want to ask ourselves is, well, why am I thinking this? Why is my gut telling me this? Why am I feeling these emotions? Why am I reacting or behaving in this way? Why do I have this attitude right now? Why am I interacting or collaborating in this way? All of a sudden, I become self-aware. I've moved from the autopilot to the pilot seat by asking myself a couple of simple questions. Now, the answers may not be so simple, but the questions are. And the whole idea about getting cognitive lift is to get ourselves to be self-aware, to be present, to be in the pilot seat. Because once we're in the pilot seat, it means our executive functions, our executive thinking of judgment and critical thinking and flexible thinking come online. And so the third set of questions we can ask ourselves is just that. Is the action. So step 3 is asking yourselves, my thinking right now, my emotions, is it actually based on a fact or is it just assumption? If it's fact like gravity, then okay, I'm on stable ground. But it's an assumption. Well, an assumption is just that. It's an assumption. It's not a law. It's not fact. And there may be things that I'm blinded to or things that I have not considered. There may be part of the pie that I have not considered. I can also ask myself questions such as, is this thinking that I have, is the way I'm feeling right now, is it actually helping me or is it hindering me? So when we're talking about a growth mindset, when we're talking about agile thinking, when we're talking about adapting to change, it's our ability to ask ourselves good questions, because at the end of the day, the simplest thing that you take away from this is the ability to move from the reactive mindset to the reflective mindset. Now, just in conclusion, let's give you some sort of takeaways. What we want to do, point 1, is to turn off autopilot and to jump into the pilot seat. A question you can ask yourselves is, how do I perceive the relationship between the resources and the demands of that situation? Am I seeing it as a challenge or as a threat? Another great question to ask ourselves is, what is my relationship with certainty and uncertainty? Am I running away from certainty? For example, the perfectionist, he or she will do the things over and over and over and over. Logically, he or she knows that the job is done, but emotionally, they need to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And why? Because they're afraid to move into uncertainty, to present themselves, because they're afraid of the comments that they may get. And so what do they rather do? They rather retreat behind the walls of certainty, right? Or you get someone who sits in a meeting and they describe themselves, I'm a listener. I like to reflect. I'm sure that's true. But the reason you're sitting at that table is that people want to hear your opinion. They want to hear your input. But because that person, he or she, fears what the other person's going to say or what the other people will say about them, they choose to race behind the walls of certainty and stay there and sit there quietly, not owning their space or speaking up. And so each time, each of us in every situation where change is there in front of us and we need to move into it, we need to ask us, what is my relationship with certainty and uncertainty? Another great question is, are you focusing on the obstacles or are you focusing on the opportunities? It doesn't matter where you are. At any point, you can choose, okay, what are the opportunities? Where are the open doors? Or we can drown ourselves in anxiety and frustration and anger and just focus on all the things that we're losing in the obstacles. It's not just about positive thinking, positive affirmation. It's far from that. What we're talking about is something much more of substance and tangibility, to be more tangible. And that's to have a balanced perspective. Yes, it's to see the upside, but what it's also the downsides. It is also to recognize there are disadvantages, but where are the advantages? If we tell ourselves to be present in the pilot seat, then we make much more balanced and integrated choices. And the last point is in your mind's parliament, which mindset has control of your floor? Is it the reactive or the reflective? You can either use the bottom-up techniques to move to the reflective, or you can use the cognitive lift to help you to be more reflective. Now, I don't think I've emphasized this, but just in this closing minutes, what I want to emphasize is that the reactive and reflective mindsets, there's not one is good and the other is bad. Both of them serve their purposes in different moments. If I'm standing in the middle of a road and as I walk across and I see a car barreling at me because some guy's on his phone and just doesn't see me, I'm not going to want to have time to think. I don't want to be reflective. I just want to react. I want to dive out of the way of the car to save my life. And so in that aspect, the reactive mindset is super important. But if I'm in the office or I'm in a workplace environment where I need to have my thinking to be clear and to be concise in my communication, I need to be able to collaborate and cooperate under stress and press. Well, then that's when the reflective mindset is going to serve me. So the mindsets, depending on the situation, in the parliament of our head, will serve different functions and will serve us in the best way possible. I know from workshops and from other talks that people always have a lot of questions. So I encourage you, if you have any questions, you have any comments, you're curious about anything, please reach out and contact me. I will be happy to answer any of your questions or to address any of your comments.